Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So last week I did a video titled Progressive Entertainment is the Product of an Unstable Mind. And this week I want to continue on that theme with all the things that didn't fit into the video last week, but are very interesting and that answer a lot of the questions about why progressive people, quote unquote progressive people, can't make a good story, can't even understand the basics of what entertainment and story are. And I partly want to do this because that last video did get a lot of views, so people seem to be interested in this, and I find it fascinating. Although, I'll have to say right at the beginning, in answer to some of the comments that I got in that last video, I'm not an expert in any of this whatsoever. I am, as I always claim on this channel, a gadfly. I throw out ideas into the public square of YouTube and see what happens. That's it. But that being said, let's jump right into this. If we want to really understand why, quote unquote, progressive people don't even understand the basis of what a story is for, first we have to look at what a story is for. Now, I'm going to do this more as a connection to, as I did last week, the psychological, which is basically how story interacts with the mind and the body to some extent. Now, I've done this on other topics over the history of my channel. I don't think that this is solely what story is for. Quite the opposite. I think this is simply part of the whole of how story interacts with human beings, because I've done videos on how the different eye structures of men and women contribute to how they interpret a story. I've discussed the importance of story to the soul when I talk about the true, the good, the beautiful. But today I'm concentrating, as I said, more on the psychological, although in my medieval and ancient brain that uses medieval and ancient logic, I would just say this is part of the instinctual, because it has to do with your nervous system and how your brain interprets input from your nervous system. So here's the thing. Again, what is story for? We love story. Story is supposed to be entertaining, supposed to make us feel good in one form or another. These are all things which I would say are accidents, logical accidents to the story. What is going on, however, when we seek out a story? And why does it appeal to us to seek out a story, let alone different kinds of stories? Well, the answer lies within your nervous system. And I'll get back to story and its connection to the nervous system in a minute or two. We just had to talk about the nervous system itself for a few minutes. So you have two main components to your nervous system that are connected to your brain. They are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the one that ramps you up and gets you ready for fight or flight. Today they call it fight, flight, or freeze, but I'm just going to call it fight or flight. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that calms you down. It takes you out of fight or flight mode. It allows you to rest and digest. And within a healthy human being, you should be able to access both of those things. You should be able to live your life wherein you hunt, so to speak, wherein you go to work, wherein you deal with stressful situations, where you have to engage your sympathetic nervous system and the fight or flight aspect of it. But when you get home, when you get to a restful spot, you're supposed to be able to, I always think of it as downshift into your parasympathetic nervous system that calms you down, that stops those stress hormones from interacting with your body, with your brain, allows you to rest, allows you to eat and digest, allows you to have some kind of fun. Now, as I said, for a normal, healthy human being, they should have access to both of these. And here's the thing, once again, for men and for women, their access to both of these is quite different. Now, as I've said dozens of times on my channel before, do I think that women and men are equal? Yes. Do I think they're the same? No. Equal does not mean the same. Equal means a balanced equation. If men were one equation and women were another equation, yes, they are equal. Just like 2 plus 3 equals 4 plus 1. Men are 2 plus 3. Women are 4 plus 1. And they equal each other. But they're not the same equation. So men and women are not the same. And this is very much understood when you're looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, because men are built for conflict, and so they are much more in their sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, and the women are more in their parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and relax. Why? Because men are bigger and stronger and are supposed to do the fighting and need to ramp themselves up very quickly, but not stay in that state. And guess how they don't stay in that state? The women are supposed to come in after they come home and bring them quickly into their parasympathetic nervous system, which women can do very quickly for men. Do both men and women have access to both the sympathetic and parasympathetic? Certainly. Do they have access to it in different degrees? Yes, indeed. Do they have access to it in different degrees that prompts very different specific kinds of behavior? Yes, indeed. Now, very quickly, what are some of the internal workings that go on to change how you are operating from your sympathetic to your parasympathetic nervous system, wherein you want to go from fight or flight to relaxation and rest and digest? Well, what happens is there's an influx of a whole bunch of different kinds of chemicals in the brain. The three most notable that I would remember would be dopamine, tryptophan, and oxytocin. Dopamine is a quick shot. Tryptophan usually is activated when you work together with other people to solve a problem. And oxytocin is commonly called the love hormone because usually it's what happens when you got a man and a woman and they are intimate with each other. But all of these things are supposed to bring you into your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest, relax, digest part of your nervous system. And again, some of these are connected to other people. Some of them you can do yourself. But the point is that if human beings are working the way human beings are, according to a society where it works correctly, yeah, you should be able to switch from one to another as an individual, and you should have a society around you, and part of that society, most notably, is a family around you that allows you to move more quickly from one to another. Family members that might make you laugh at something, make you feel good. Family members that you can solve problems with. Family members that you share actual love with. And again, it's the difference between and connection of men and women. And here's the thing with story. Story is an external element that allows us to do that as well. Story is not just something we enjoy when we're in our parasympathetic nervous system, where we're resting and relaxing. It is also a mechanism which allows us to enter into our parasympathetic nervous system, calming us down and giving us something relaxing to do. This is why a good book or a good story should put you at ease. A good comedy should make you laugh. Laughter actually is one of the top things that will switch your mood from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic nervous system. And there's been studies to show that even if they force people to smile for a specific amount of time, that is, put something in their mouths wherein their mouths are turned upwards into a smile, even though they're not actually trying to smile as people, it actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system. There's other hacks that you can use like that as well. But for story, it's just entertain you by telling you a funny story, allowing you to laugh, allowing you to feel good. And that would be the base level, I would say, of what story is used for in connection to changing you into a relaxed, calm, and entertained person. And further to that, you can then add the extra layers of the fact that you're interacting in some way with these characters, if it's a good story, in order to, let's say, solve a problem, which is what murder mysteries are about. And so, what do you get? You get a hit of tryptophan. And, moreover, if you have romantic stories, it might just give you a bit of a boost in oxytocin. Now, these are all supplements to what should naturally be going on in your life, but it's kind of like the hack of making you smile to improve your mood. It's the same thing. We just figured this out long and ever ago. This is what stories do and help us do. Now, here's the problem with stories, however, and we'll get into the problem with stories themselves before moving into the problem of quote-unquote progressive stories. But the problem with stories themselves is that they should be used as one of these hacks to your nervous system in order to help it do what it naturally should be doing. But if you start depending upon it instead of the people around you and your own internal mechanisms to calm yourself down, you got yourself a problem. And part of that problem is the fact that stories are not real. They're supposed to be a reflection of reality. We go back to the original definition of story for our civilization, which comes from Aristotle, who was working off stories 1,200 years older than he was. This was in the 4th century BC, by the way. That's how he defined partly what story is. It's supposed to be a reflection of reality so that it becomes that substitute of allowing us to move into the rest and relaxation state. But it's not supposed to be, first of all, something that moves us into that state despite our natural inclinations and interactions with other people to do so. And it's not supposed to be a full reality that is so contrary to what you see around you that it tricks your body and your nervous system into thinking reality is something it isn't, and or that you should be calmed down by very specific things which aren't real. Why? Because if you get used to the fact that you're getting calmed down by these things which aren't real, and then you have to deal with reality, which is most of your life, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. This is the point wherein I interject that this is why I'm thinking about this. Why? Because the idea of hero, which is what my channel is centered around, is based upon a paragon of virtue. Those virtues are only establishable through right reason being your reason in accord with reality, which means that you have to accept reality around you. And that includes the reality of what you're going to accept as a story as you engage your suspension of disbelief. But no, the stories that these people create are stories based upon a faux and faulty version of reality, specifically. And this is part of the problem with the way we use stories today, currently. I honestly think in the far distant future, when they look back at our time in history, and they look at things like fandoms and the tremendous glut of quote-unquote romance novels, they will be seen as something akin to telltale signs of mental illness. Something like the dancing plagues of the Middle Ages. And if you don't know what those are, go look them up. That's a fun part of history. Now, having said all that, let's move into the territory of why, quote-unquote, progressive stories are so detrimental to actual entertainment and why they are simply bad stories. It's because progressives don't understand what a story is for. Why? Well, let's connect some of these things together. And here's where I'll stop and say, although you don't have to listen to my last week video in order to understand what I'm about to say, it might behoove you just a little bit, if you want to know more, to go back and listen to that video if you haven't. Now, you remember I said at the first of this video that there are very specific roles within the switching of your nervous system from one to another of male and female. And the thing is that if you look at today and you look at certain points of history, you can see a repeating pattern over and over again. It is the collapse of civilizations, which usually start with the mixing of roles of men and women, and then the destruction of the family unit. You can go back to things like the Bacchae of ancient Greece, or the destruction of the paterfamilia in ancient Rome, the cult of Mithra in the Middle Ages, and today with identity politics. And not just identity politics, but the origin of identity politics, which would be feminism. Because what feminism tries to do, and has tried to do for the last little while, is to convince people that men and women are the same. When I said at the first of this video, I don't believe that at all. They're equal, but not the same. No, feminism wants you to believe that they're the same, that women can do the same jobs as men and still come out not only with the same results externally, but also the same results internally, when we know that's just not the case. Yeah, sure, women can do the jobs that men do. But just as if you have, let's say, a physically demanding job, on average, women are not as big or as strong as men, and therefore, on average, you're not going to get the same result from the average woman and the average man doing the same physical labor. You're just not. And the same thing happens internally as well. Sure, you can get a woman that will do the same job as a man, but she's being impacted in various different ways that men can handle, especially if it's a high stress, high conflict profession that would not affect a man as much as it does a woman. Why? Because of the difference in ability to move in and out of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system for men and women. The ability to handle conflict, to gear up to conflict very quickly and gear down very quickly as men can do. If you put a woman in that situation, she's going to be hard-pressed to do the exact same thing if she's your average woman. And vice versa. If you have men which are trying to take on the same roles as women traditionally should take on, the same thing is going to happen. So what happens in a society where everyone is taught that men and women are the same? Well, they're taught that the way that you actually engage with your nervous system is according to this feminist ideal where everyone is the same, which gives you a dysregulated ability to move in and out of one nervous system to the other. I don't care if you're men or women. The confusion goes both ways. And that's just the first stage of feminism. But we've now moved into the second to third stage, because once you get those people who believe that their dysregulated way of dealing mainly with their emotions, because that's one of the things which switches you from one system to the other, it's very much instinctual, emotional. That's how that switchover begins. And one of the main components of how you get into a rest and relaxation state or an anger and fight state. Once you have people which are so dysregulated that they don't really know how to switch from one state to another in a healthy way, and then they have families and bring up children, well, guess what you're going to have? Well, you're going to have a whole bunch of children who are taught, if at all, a dysregulated way from the very beginning of how to deal with their emotions and how to deal with the world around them, if at all. And if you do not know how to control your emotions correctly, being able to move in and out of one of these nervous systems to the other, and you go through puberty, basically between the ages of 12 and 20, and you still don't know how to regulate your own system, regulate your own emotions, then that time between 12 and 20, where you build your own identity, where as a healthy human being, you're supposed to build your own identity, because that's when your identity and your brain actually hardens. You become who you are. Up until the age of about 12, your brain is basically modeling clay, wherein between 12 and about 20 years old, it starts to become a hardened statue. So after that 20-year-old part, it's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to change who you actually are, to change your personality, to change how your personality actually works. Again, not impossible, but much more difficult. It's not modeling clay that you can swish around with your hands. You're going to have to take a hammer and chisel and hope you don't make mistakes. And the thing being, like I talked about in last week's video, if you don't have the ability to control your emotions and move yourself from one state to another when you're building this identity, you have, in the end, built yourself a fractured identity by the time you're done. Once again, as I said last week, I picture it in this way. A healthy person who has built themselves a healthy identity, especially during this time, is like a Jenga tower with all its pieces there. Now, even if those pieces here and there are wrong, and you find out they're wrong and have to take a piece out, you have systems available to you in order to put another piece in, or at the very least, for your entire Jenga tower not to fall over, and therefore you still have a stable identity, even though you realize after a while through the process of living that some of those things you believed and built your identity on between the ages of 12 and 20 were actually wrong. But a person who doesn't know how to control their emotions and was not taught, and certainly cannot teach themselves, how to regulate their emotions and their movement from one sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system back and forth, they build themselves a Jenga tower of their own identity, which is at best shaky beyond belief. There are so many pieces missing that it is barely standing. And sometimes the only way that they can actually keep their little tower standing is through little cheats here and there, by being, let's say, codependent with another person. And if that person disappears, they will crumble. Or sometimes codependent upon other ideas which they believe to be true. And this brings us into the fact, as I discussed last week, that this is why you have these people who are obsessed with identity. Why? Because their own identity is so fragile. And they really have no idea how a healthy identity is supposed to look. And beyond that, they can't take any kind of negativity or criticism at all. Why? Because if you criticize them, even in the slightest way, it's going to be a blow to their identity, and their identity is on such shaky ground that it's going to fall apart if you even enter a strong breeze into the situation. And thus is born the internal workings of individuals which support the ideas of identity politics. Ideas like, you can switch your identity to anything under the sun. And why do they think something like that? Because they don't have a fully formed identity to begin with, nor do they understand what a healthy identity looks like. Now, let's move this back into how this entire thing affects story in two different ways. Number one, the corruption of story in order to become a codependent idea holding these people up in their broken identities, which normally would simply fall over if they were subject to simply the basic norms of society. The original people that came up with the ideas, which are the origin of identity politics in its various forms, feminism in its various forms, while I wouldn't technically call them smart people, I would say they were very devious and conniving people and were able to pick out things that they could use very easily. And which, by the way, is one of the hallmark personality traits of someone who doesn't know how to regulate their own system. It's use of other people rather than interacting with other people. Oh yeah, let's just pull on that thread for 1 second. See, here's the reason why these quote-unquote progressive people are so lonely and miserable as opposed to a normal person. Why? Because they typically are very lonely, even if they have friends. Why? Because a true friend is someone who you can open up to, who you can share your identity with, the good parts and the bad parts. And that helps you work through problems, which again gives you a hit of something like tryptophan, which allows you the internal mechanisms to deal with your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous systems. But for these quote-unquote progressive people, they're alone and miserable, even if they have friends. Why? Because they're not true friends. Why? Because they can't open up to those friends and actually share their true identity with them, the good and the bad. Why? Because they're not able to deal with any kind of criticism whatsoever. So if someone actually points out, hey, wait a second, that part is not right there, yeah, their entire identity will crumble. And therefore, they can't even allow anyone else to see the internal workings of themselves, how dysregulated it is, how many flaws there are there, because even allowing someone to see those things would be too much for their identity to handle. Therefore, they can't connect with other people. Sure, they may have allies. Again, I went through Marvel podcasts for an entire year of how to build allies. Sure, they have allies, people they work with. They have no friends. They're not true friends. These are lonely, miserable people because their identity is so fractured, they can't actually connect to other people correctly. They can't even connect to themselves correctly, let alone other people. And if you go back 100, almost 125 years now, easy, looking into the origin of some of these ideas that are the origins of things like feminism and identity politics, what is their go-to of trying to connect to people? It says, go seek out the loner. Go seek out the people who think they're disenfranchised, that have no access to society and don't fit in. Gee, I wonder why they don't fit in. And then the second step is to indoctrinate them into ideas which will support, in a codependent way, their fractured identity. So that if that political movement gets swept away, they too will get swept away because they depend so desperately on it to affirm them. And this is the propaganda that you see around you in entertainment today, because they've been doing it for at least, in this present form, 125 years. They're using story in this way because they know that story can provide a faux system whereby you can substitute for what you should be doing in normal life and connecting to society and other people around you and your family and yourself. It provides a faux system, one based upon a faux reality, which is actually false, that will support the fractured identity of these people. This is why you have these stories and these storytellers say, oh, well, we have to put in these strong, independent women. Why? Because it supports the idea that men and women are the same. Or you have to put in people where they can see themselves, especially if they are of this or that identity group, which is marginalized. Why do they need to see themselves? Well, they need to see a version of themselves in a faux reality wherein their identity is actually affirmed and works in a healthy way, because it will never work in a healthy way in actual reality. So they need to be brainwashed into thinking that this is actually a way that you can live your life. And that's the meaning of so many of these quote-unquote progressive tropes. You show a person who can change their identity from one thing to another very quickly and have no consequence, because that doesn't work in reality. You show a whole bunch of women who are the bestest ever at the sciences, because that typically isn't the way it works in reality. You show people who do not in any way have the skills to be a leader suddenly becoming a leader in these stories, because that's not how it's going to work in reality. And above all, you show these strong, independent women that need no man, because on average, a woman does need a man, or she's going to be haggard at the end of her life, to say the least, if not chewed up and spit out by reality. Because also, she's not strong and independent. The average woman is simply not. Especially if you look at the term of independent, the way that they define independent, wherein you should be able to do everything yourself. But I'm sorry, you're not. You're not going to be able to. And that's really the entire point of why these creators make really bad stories. It's because these quote-unquote progressive people switch out the idea of independence for hyper-independence. Hyper-independence being where you need no one or nothing. You can do everything yourself. Now, can you actually do everything yourself? Is there a way for a human being to do so? Sure there is. But it's the equivalent of, usually within some of these psychological discussions, it's thought of as you live in a little community in, say, the Middle Ages, and Vikings come along and destroy your entire village except for you, and they take you as a slave. And you live as a slave among these Vikings. You're not part of them. They don't teach you to be a part of them. You're independent. You have to struggle even to survive. And what happens to a person like that? A person like that would need to be in fight or flight mode 24 hours a day in order to survive. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Does it lead to a healthy individual? Not in any way, shape, or form. And that's what these people are. Because it's like a set of dominoes. Again, if you don't have parents that are going to teach you how to regulate your emotions, when it comes time to have to regulate your emotions in order to build your own identity, you're not going to be able to do so. And therefore, you're not going to be able to build a stable identity. If you don't have a stable identity and you move on into life, you can't take any kind of criticism whatsoever, and you can't connect to other people whatsoever by allowing them in to see your true self. Why? Because if they poke at it even slightly, the entire thing will topple over, and you'll go from someone who's basically neurotic and has, something like borderline personality disorder, right into some kind of psychosis. Therefore, such people can never trust anyone. They have no true friends. They have no one who can really help them. They can try to manipulate other people into getting what they want, but no one is truly going to ever know them. No one is truly ever going to connect with them because they can't allow anybody to connect with them. And if you live your life in that way, your nervous system is going to always be in fight or flight mode. You will always be in your sympathetic nervous system, never in your parasympathetic nervous system, never in the rest, relax, and digest phase, which is so essential for a healthy person. And trust me, I know people like this. I have people like this in my family, and I pity them so much. You try to help them, and they will not allow you to help them because help, if they admit that they need help, is an admission that there's something wrong with the internal workings of their personality, and therefore, if they even admit that, the whole thing will come crashing down. So they can't even admit to having help from other people. And their lives are miserable. Why? Because they're in fight, flight, or freeze mode constantly. And I do mean 24 hours a day. These people can't even sleep correctly. That's why there are so many sleep disorders associated with these kinds of people. They have insomnia, or if they do sleep, it's not actual restful sleep because they're constantly in fight or flight mode. There's never a moment they can be in rest mode because if they let down their guard, even for a moment, they will be destroyed. And before moving on, I just want to say, just imagine how spectacularly miserable that existence would actually be. And I'm sorry, but most of these progressive people, that's their existence. And I am truly sorry for them. And the thing is that these are the people they're tasking with writing stories right now. And if you don't even understand that you have a parasympathetic nervous system, nor can move in and out of one system to another, if you never understand what relaxation is, if you never understand what a person needs in order to connect with others, you can't understand the basic mechanism of why people enjoy entertainment. This is why, to someone who is steeped in feminism or identity politics, and again, my entire channel is a history of these people writing stories for various companies of Marvel and DC. If you're in that mindset, this is why you create stories which are nothing but preaching, which are nothing but propaganda, which are nothing but teaching other people how to act. Why? Because to them, they're not supposed to be entertainment. They don't understand what entertainment actually is because they don't understand that stories are supposed to be about rest and relaxation. They don't understand what rest and relaxation is. They have no point of reference. Literally, except for maybe dim memories of when they were a child. And then you take that mindset, which doesn't understand the basis of what entertainment actually is, and you mix in the other parts of identity politics, which is the political part, which is the propaganda of saying, sure, you can act this way. Let's give you some propaganda within a story. Doesn't matter what kind of story it is, on the news, in your comic books, on your tabletop games, within school. Doesn't matter. They feed you the narrative that, yes, you can live this way. Yes, this is a regulated way in order to live, and you can flourish. It's not true, but it is the support system they need in order to hold up their crumbling identity. And this is why, like it or not, with the very specific hiring practices of trying to hire this kind of minority, this kind of marginalized group, etc., etc. This is why you have these unstable, dysregulated, selfish, self-centered, and truly wretched and pitiable people trying to create your entertainment and destroying your ability to use it to relax, let down your guard, and actually have some kind of rest. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.